We're going to get started on our next panel. Thank you all for joining us here at the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion hosted by Clean Air Task Force. My name's Jonathan Banks and I'm the Global Director for the Methane Program here at Clean Air Task Force. This next panel is going to dive into what's been happening in the Americas to cut methane emissions from a variety of sectors, oil and gas, waste, and others. If you go back on the history of methane mitigation, the amount of work that has been happening in the Americas is astounding. If you look at the Global Methane Pledge, if you actually map the Global Methane Pledge out, from Canada all the way down to Argentina and Chile, almost the entire two continents are covered with supporters of the Global Methane Pledge. So it's only right that we would spend some time at COP talking about the work that's been done. It doesn't mean that we've solved the problem of methane emissions in the Americas by any means, but the level of interest and the level of attention that exists for methane emission reduction programs and policies in the Americas is truly astounding. So I'm really excited about this panel that we have, and I'm only going to do a brief introduction here, and then I will be quiet, at least for a little while, and then I might be forced to ask questions. So today, we've got some great folks to talk with. Carolina from the Global Methane Hub is the director of the Circular Economy section of the Global Methane Hub. Formerly with the Chilean government, spent a lot of time running around COPs like this. Then we got Jeremy Hewitt from British. Oh, I didn't do that. I don't know why that's doing that. There we go. We got Jeremy Hewitt from British Columbia in Canada. Who is heading up a lot of their work around methane emissions in Canada. Gustavo from CEMDA, who's been working on methane emission reductions in Mexico. And we have Wang from the State Department, from Secretary Kerry's department, working on climate mitigation and methane mitigation in the United States. And, I'm on the wrong one, there we go. Then we have Camila from Chile, who's from the Environment Ministry in Chile, working on methane mitigation in Chile. So we will now turn to the panel here, and we've got like maybe 5-10 minutes for each of the speakers to talk about what's happening in their country. And then we'll move into a panel discussion, which Chris Severson Baker from Pembina Institute will lead. So I guess we'll start here on this end. Maybe go with Gustavo. You want to go first?
No problem.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm Gustavo from the Mexican Environmental Law Center in Mexico City. I would like to divide my short presentation in two parts. The first, I would like to give you some ideas on where is Mexico today with respect to methane emissions. And the second part, I would like to give some ideas on where we can go together in the Americas. So I would like to start by mentioning, for example, that in the year 2004, Mexico was part of the Global Methane Initiative, which started in that year. Second, I would also like to mention that in the year 2012, Mexico, among other countries, founded the Climate and Air Initiative. Then in 2016, in January, the National Hydrocarbons Commission published certain dispositions for the natural gas exploitation. Then also in 2016, in June of that same year, during the Summit of the Americas among Mexico, US, and Canada, Mexico committed to the reduction of methane emissions from the oil and gas sector in 40% by the year 2025. Then in November 2018, the agency in Mexico that is related to safety, environment, and energy published some dispositions for the prevention and control of methane emission of the hydrocarbon sector. Then, going to the year 2019, the National Institute of Ecology, which is part of the Mexican government, published what is called the integrated strategies with respect to the short-lived climate pollutants to improve air quality and reduce its contributions to climate change. Then, in the year 2020, when Mexico supposedly updated its NDC, it contemplated it as an area of opportunity for emissions mitigation, what we call the implementation of a policy related to reduction of methane emissions. Then, in 2021, in September, when Mexico was getting ready for the COP26, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador joined the Global Methane Pledge that has, as you all know, the objective of reducing the methane emissions in 30% by the year 2030, no? Yeah, correct. Thank you. And finally, in this context that I'm giving you with respect to Mexico, let me tell you that this year, in the event of the big energy and climate economies, also the President of Mexico presented 10 actions that are being implemented to fight in Mexico against climate change, where they include to reduce or to capture 98% of the methane emissions in the exploration and production processes related to the oil industry. And the last one in this context that I'm giving you is that also this year, in a joint statement with President Biden from the United States, Mexico committed to take care of the methane emissions and to develop an implementation plan to eliminate the burning and leakages from the oil and gas operations at sea and inland and identify priorities for investment. So that's what is happening in Mexico today. I think the big challenge that we still have is that we may go to an effective, to a proper implementation of all this that has to do with law and policy. Finally, in my second part of my presentation, I would like to put some ideas before the table that I believe or we believe we can do in the Americas. First of all, I think we need to promote transparency. No? We need to promote transparency with respect to the data that are being collected, with respect to the methane emissions, and I think that information has to be, how do you say, distribuida or compartida? Should be shared. I think we believe that that information has to be shared among governments, no, of the Americas. We believe that it's not only to share information among NGOs, but among the governments, among regulators. We believe that if that information is made available to the public, this will allow all those who are interested in these matters to be in a position to verify, not to check that this information is reliable with respect to the reduction of methane emissions. And I think this will bring us also to accountability, no? That sometimes nobody takes responsibility for anything, no? So I think accountability is very important to have success. Second, we believe that it is vital to promote an effective regional collaboration, which may allow all of us to have more experts in the field. For example, we know that Colombia already published this year its regulations related to methane, and we know also that Ecuador is moving in that direction. So it will be our desire that in the future we can have a strong collaboration of all countries in the Americas, in the region, that have the methane regulations in order to exchange lessons and experiences. Because this is somehow new for many of our countries, I think there's a lot to learn between Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Ecuador, and all the countries around the Americas. The third point, of four that I have, is that we believe it is necessary to have more discussions about access to financing. Financing for what? For the proper and effective implementation of solutions that allow the reduction of methane emissions in the oil and gas sector, as well, and not only there, but as well as in those sectors related to solid waste and agriculture. This is not only about oil and gas, no? It's about agriculture, it's about solid waste. And finally, and with this I finish my presentation, we are of the opinion that more resources are needed to fully train all those who may be involved in these matters. We need more human resources with respect to new information that is coming out about methane emissions. And this information, as you know, it's coming from up there, no? It's coming from the satellites, no? So we need those experts that help us to translate that information and make it available not only to society, but also to public officials, so they will be in a position to take decisions, to implement policy, and to have law in place. So I would like to leave it here, and I thank again for the opportunity. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Maybe let's go to Claire next.
Thank you so much. So I just want to take a quick step back and emphasize again why methane emissions reduction is so critical for the overall climate agenda. And this is because methane is accountable for nearly half of the net warming the world is currently experiencing, and it will be impossible to keep warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius without accelerated, targeted reductions in methane emissions. Every year, this year and every year before that, we have reached new record highs in the concentration of methane in the atmosphere. And without additional action, we are poised to see a 13% increase in global methane emissions by 2030, which would put our climate targets far beyond reach. Just as much as methane emissions is a challenge for climate action, it's also an immense opportunity because methane, as a potent, short-lived greenhouse gas, can actually achieve reductions in global temperatures by mid-century if we start reducing emissions today. So that's the reason why the United States and the European Union, alongside over 100 other countries, launched the Global Methane Pledge last year at COP26 to reduce global methane emissions at least 30% by 2030 from 2020 levels, which is the minimum amount needed to stay aligned with 1.5C trajectories. This year at COP27, we'll be celebrating the progress we've made over the past year on the Global Methane Pledge. Much of this will happen at a methane ministerial that will be taking place this Thursday at 3 p.m., which I very much invite you to attend. But today, I'm very happy to speak to the actions that we're taking in the United States to achieve the Global Methane Pledge target and also to drive additional action internationally. Last Friday, President Biden launched an update to the U.S. Methane Emissions Reduction Action Plan, which showcases how in the United States, we are investing more than $20 billion to reduce methane emissions across our domestic fossil energy, agriculture, and waste sectors. This includes a novel methane fee that has been put forward through the Inflation Reduction Act. That is the first time the United States has put a price on a greenhouse gas that will begin to come into effect in 2 years from now and rise in the future. That will take place in lockstep with enhanced regulatory activities from our U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which were just unveiled this past Friday. EPA estimates that this new strengthened proposed regulation will reduce emissions from covered sources by 87% by 2030 from 2005 levels. That goes beyond the estimated 74% reduction from EPA's proposed rule last November. So we are strengthening everything we can on the regulatory side to tackle emissions in the fossil energy sector, which has the greatest share of currently cost-effective and technically feasible mitigation opportunity, especially now in an era of extremely high natural gas prices and global energy insecurity. So those are our two marquee aspects of action on methane, but they're certainly not the only things that we are doing. We're also taking ambitious steps to address methane emissions from downstream gas pipelines across the fairly extensive network of transmission and distribution pipelines in the United States. We're tackling methane from abandoned oil and gas wells and coal mines. We're investing in climate-smart agriculture to find ways that we can both reduce emissions from our agricultural sector while also improving food security and resilience in the climate era. We're partnering with industry to drive methane reductions in the waste and wastewater sector, and we're backing all of this up not only at the national level, but also through subnational and industry-led activities. So I definitely encourage all of you to take a look at that updated methane action plan when you have a moment. It's available on the White House website. And before I turn it over to my colleagues from across the Americas, I also just want to note the fantastic collaboration that is happening on methane reduction in the Americas, which Jonathan has already spoken to. But in addition to the activities that were outlined earlier between the US and Mexico specifically, I'm very happy that EPA, our Environmental Protection Agency, and Pemex, which is Mexico's national oil company, have now begun their cooperation to deliver on that implementation plan and will be putting forward a draft by the first half of 2023. So this just shows how we are leveraging our expertise to develop the types of capacity building and hopefully eventually financing that is needed to achieve reductions in this sector. Similarly, with Canada, we are both co-chairs of the Global Methane Initiative, which is currently housed within the EPA as a secretariat and is driving public-private partnerships for methane reduction internationally. And of course, as the U.S. is a co-chair of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, we have the ability and the commitment to helping the entire world achieve more ambitious methane mitigation by leveraging technical assistance and capacity building. And there have been a number of projects that have implemented through CCAC in the Americas and abroad. So we're clearly very excited about this as both a climate opportunity, as an energy security opportunity, as a food security opportunity, and as a development opportunity. And we are driving those methane emissions down both within the United States and leveraging those lessons abroad.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm Camila from Chile. And so I will talk to you a little bit about methane emissions in Chile and what we are doing now to reduce them. So methane emissions in Chile are 14% of our total GHG emissions. We don't have much oil and gas, so oil and gas is only 12% of our methane emissions. And the waste sector is 44%. And the agriculture is 43%. And our methane emissions have been increasing since 1990, exactly in 28% till year 2020. The sector that is increasing the most is the waste sector because our population increases and we have only landfills that produce methane. And seeing as how important reducing methane very fast is that we decided to look specifically to methane. Till now, when we think about mitigation action and policies, we look more in the energy sector because it's our biggest sector. But this year we have been working specifically in looking on how to reduce methane, mainly in the waste and the agriculture sector. And with this, we are submitting now an annex to our NDC to make it more strong and to look on how implementation will look like. And in this new annex in NDC, we are committing to stop the increase of our methane emissions by 2025 and reduce them. And then this will also put that we will have in 2025 more focus also in our new NDC. And we also this year approved a climate change law in Chile. And in the frame of this law, that the main objective is to be carbon neutral at the latest by 2050. And this law establishes that we have to develop sectorial mitigation plans. So next year we will be developing a plan for the agriculture sector and for the waste sector that will have specific actions that will be has to be implemented in the next years to reduce methane emissions. So that's our context for now. Thank you.
Hey everyone, it's good to be here. In particular, I want to say it's excellent to be sharing the stage with the Pembina Institute. If you're not familiar, they are an absolutely premier organization that's really advancing the dialogue, I can speak for Canada, with evidence-based practical solutions. And I can say there are a lot of organizations that don't necessarily take those two pieces into account in the climate file. Pembina is definitely one of them. So I'm here as part of the Canadian delegation. There's a lot of work being done across Canada on methane from the federal government, from Alberta as well. But I work for the government of British Columbia. And I'll keep it brief. I'll just say we have regulations in place now that set a reduction in methane from the oil and gas sector of 45% by 2025. And the good news is they're working. So we have moved past the point of targets in BC, and we're actually seeing results. And we have committed alongside Canada to increase that ambition to a 75% reduction by 2030 and a near elimination of all industrial methane by 2035. I'm already learning something on this panel. It was great to hear my colleague from Mexico talk about what's underway there. And in particular, one area we're really struggling with is in the coal mining sector. So I was really happy to hear my colleague from the United States talk about research there, and I hope to talk to you after about that.
Before we go to the question and answer piece, Chris, maybe you could say a little bit about what Canada's doing at the federal level on methane. I think there's been some really exciting announcements coming out already. This COP on next steps for Canada on methane, especially in the oil and gas space. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about at the federal level what Canada's doing.
Sure. Yeah, and I've worked on the oil and gas industry and methane emissions for pretty much all of my career. Starting before, we were really focused on methane. We were trying to address air quality. We were trying to reduce flaring and venting of natural gas. And, so it's great to see, with all my panel members that, in the last decade, the focus is really now clearly on methane and as a really potent greenhouse gas and there's really determined action to address it rather than trying to get at it sort of indirectly by addressing other issues, the way we were dealing with it in the 90s and early 2000s. In Canada, so Canada is moving ahead with its commitment to achieve 75%. So we just announced at this COP sort of a discussion document around their proposed regulations for how they would achieve that. We're starting to look at that as an organization because we're an advocacy organization. Will be providing comments back to the government on whether or not we believe that that's going to get us to where we need to go. But this government has demonstrated that they're quite committed to meeting those targets and trying to exceed them. The one interesting point that I wanted to raise in the context of Canada is that Canada also has a commitment to cap its emissions from oil and gas and then have that cap decline over time. And because methane is part of the oil and gas sector, there's an opportunity to go really hard and deep on methane reductions because that's the cheaper emission reduction opportunities in the upstream oil and gas sector. Other things will, maybe it will contribute very significant reductions, but they take more time to implement than methane. And so we're hoping that, we can see a lot of momentum, and then the information gathered from Canada about how you reduce emissions from that sector anyways will be hopefully useful in other places in the world as well. So why don't we? I'm going to start with Claire here, but you know, when we were talking about all the action that's happening around tackling methane emissions, what do you think was the most critical enabler to helping to get that action started?
So I think this question could have a lot of different answers depending on the scope at which you're thinking about it. In the United States, we've been taking action on methane for some number of years now, certainly predating the Global Methane Pledge. And of course, the principal source of methane emissions in the United States is from the oil and gas sector. And in that sector, the key enabling factor is that methane is not just a waste product, but in fact a resource, because natural gas is primarily composed of methane. So the fundamental economics and technical options for reducing methane in the oil and gas sector are much more straightforward than in other sectors. Of course, other sectors have also fairly easy implementation opportunities as well. But this fundamental fact that capturing methane in the oil and gas sector is not only essential for climate action, indeed above and beyond what we can achieve through decarbonization pathways alone, we need to see very rapid and steep cuts in methane from the fossil energy sector. But in light especially of general economic incentives to capture the thing that you're actually producing, but especially now after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when gas prices are so high and every spare cubic meter of gas is highly important, it is all the more reason for industry to want to take action in this sector. One other development that's been important in the context of fossil energy methane reduction in particular is we're seeing much more interest by buyers of natural gas, especially international importers of natural gas and oil and coal, to address the associated methane emissions footprint. So last year, the EU put forward their draft methane regulations that first establishes certain data reporting and transparency requirements for all of the fossil energy that's imported to the EU, and which will eventually move towards more stringent policy options that are currently being discussed. We also saw last Friday a joint declaration by the United States, the EU, Japan, Canada, Norway, Singapore, and the United Kingdom, some of the world's largest producers and consumers of fossil fuels, put together a joint declaration saying that we're going to move together to be reducing the emissions associated with fossil energy imports and associated with fossil energy production. And this just shows how enhanced demand signals, or indeed actual tools to encourage, incentivize, or require methane reductions from fossil energy production, are very helpful in getting increased interest from the producer side and actually achieving those outcomes, especially in countries that may not have as strong of domestic regulatory forcings as the United States does, to ensure that the energy being traded on international markets today is as low in greenhouse gas intensity as possible, in order to ensure that as the energy transition is playing out and we're accelerating the deployment of renewables, we can ensure that any lingering fossil energy consumption has as low climate impact as possible. And this is not just consistent with our climate objectives, it is absolutely imperative to our climate objectives. Since, as I said before, we can't keep 1.5C within reach without acting on methane now. So that is just a fundamental fact for the energy sector in particular, and I'll leave it to my colleagues to discuss other sector opportunities.
Thanks. Thank you, Claire. Maybe I'll go to you now, Gustavo. Maybe what are one or two sort of critical things that enabled action on methane in your experience in Mexico?
I would like to mention 2 or 3 things. The first one, I believe, as I mentioned in my presentation, the Mexican government has done a lot of things in the last 15, 18 years. No? So we're happy for that. But the big problem, as it has happened in many other areas, is the proper implementation, is the enforcement. No? We would like to see the authority to be behind of those who have to comply in order to assure that they are doing their duties accordingly. No? And as you may recall, since we signed NAFTA in 1994 with the US, one of the big challenges then was the enforcement. No? Today, in the year 2022, enforcement is still a big issue for Mexico. Even though we have the policies, we have the laws, we have the institutions, no? We have the funding, probably not as much funding as we would like to have, but we have some funding. But things don't move as they should, no? So we would like to see the regulators doing their job as they should, no? And also we would like to see that the information that it is reported, it belongs to reality, no? Because let me give you one data. In the case of fugitive emissions, there's a report from the Climate Action Tracker that says that emissions are 10 times of what it is reported. So are we going to make sure that this is done accordingly? So that's why I say the authority has a big role to play, no? Now that we have the regulations in place, now that we have the policy, that we have the agreements, that we have signed the pledges, I mean, we have done a lot, but we are just one step, which is a big one, in order to assure that there's an effective enforcement and compliance of all these regulations.
Thank you, Gustavo. And then maybe from Chile's perspective, maybe what are some of the one or two key enablers for what has happened already in terms of action on methane in your country?
Thank you. I would say that we have a lot of political will to working on reducing methane, and in general, from the different sides of politics, the different political positions, there's a general agreement that climate change is one of the biggest challenges we have now. And so it's easy to move forward in this political context, because we all know that it is one of the most important things we have to move now. So I think that's the main thing that has been enabling to go forward. We haven't started yet, as our colleague from Mexico said, in big steps for implementation. We're still planning, but there's the will, there are the goals. So I hope we can move forward, and there are barriers and challenges, but I think with political will, it will be easier.
Sure, thanks. I definitely co-sign some of the comments I heard before, particularly Claire from you around, frankly, the market fundamentals that make it, in the grand scheme of things, pretty cost-effective to reduce methane emissions, particularly from the oil and gas sector. So I'm not a methane expert per se, but I do run the team in BC that's responsible for climate policy sort of writ large. And when we run the marginal abatement curves in BC, some of the most effective and cheapest opportunities are in the methane sector from the oil and gas, so that helps. But what I think I'll highlight, though, is, and I heard my colleague from Mexico talking about transparency, it's really, sounds kind of cheesy, but collaboration and transparency. And so when we were developing these regulations, we actually did it in full partnership with an environmental organization, Pembina, with industry, with the regulator, and with government. And we did a lot of research, a lot of studies. We published the full results of all of those and really came up with a regulation together. And that helped immediately get buy-in from industry. The environmental community was given assurance that it was a credible, ambitious regulation. And again, from the regulator's perspective, they knew it was something they could actually enforce. So it was that framework, I think, that was especially productive and helpful in BC.
Maybe hang on to that for a second, Jeremy, and then maybe you could speak to, what are some of the barriers that were sort of unseen that got in the way of actually tackling methane? What, in your experience, what would you say from BC's experience?
Some of the barriers? Well, I think, and I'm kind of guilty of this, we need to remember that methane is not just about oil and gas. So there are a lot of other sectors, at least in BC, that emit methane. So I think we need to broaden our scope there as well and focus on that. Again, there's experts on methane on this panel, including you, Chris. I'll just say, as the leader of an organization, one of the barriers, one of the challenges is finding people with the skills to actually work for government, to be the inspectors, to be the regulators. That's kind of a 100,000-foot issue. But I think governments in particular need to really think about how we attract particularly young, diverse, smart people to come work for us to enforce these regulations.
Great, thank you. I think we're starting to notice that Gustavo's list of 6 things is coming up in the conversation over and over again, so obviously a good list. But going to Carolina, you're not representing a country, but you're representing a big global initiative. What are your thoughts on sort of what are the next steps from a policy perspective and the kind of obstacles that are going to need to be overcome?
Well, thanks, and thanks for the great conversation. I came from the Global Methane Hub. We are a philanthropic effort to align funding on methane advocacy. And in fact, we do exactly what, or we want to do exactly what we were talking about. It's like we drive collaboration and coordination about methane mitigation. And for that, we support countries, for example, in building methane assessment, like cost-effective analysis, for example. We are working in Latin America with some countries like Chile, for example, Uruguay and Argentina, in order to give them the information they need to make the decisions and to, for example, present the methane action plans or things like that. So that's great, you know, and I think it's so important because you need to work with governments in order to have that plans. But we talk also about implementation, and I think you're totally right, because it's important to understand that Latin America, I'm not talking for North America, we're going to do that also, but if we talk about Latin America, we are the second largest emitters in methane, you know, after China. And this is like around 15% of the global emissions. And we only track for 3% of the investment related with methane, you know. So we have a huge gap there because you need implementation, but for that you need finance. So how we could work on that is, I think, a huge challenge for us and what we want to achieve. And what I think it's also important, and we talk about, is about transparency, about data. And for that, I think, because we are used to work, you know, considering our GHG inventories, which is like a top-down approach, you know. But now, with satellite monitoring, we have a huge opportunity, you know, to look facilities bottom up and to have the information. Of course, we have a lot of questions regarding how we calibrate this, you know, like these measurements with the inventories. But we need to work on that. And for that, we need collaboration and coordination.
Thank you. I'm going to go over to Camila again. And I mean, this time, sort of, you know, when you think about benefits to communities, you know, around the world, I mean, what do you sort of see them as standing to gain from the kinds of methane policies that we're all talking about, you know, domestically and internationally?
Thank you. Chris, right? In agriculture sector and waste sector, there's a very huge link with communities because, for example, for the waste sector, it's not only a problem of methane, it's a huge problem with what to do with waste. And that happens in a very local way. So you have different levels of organizations that is needed to work together so you can move forward with methane reductions. And in the waste sector, you don't have to think only in what to do with the methane emissions, but also what you do with waste and how you help the community in this process. This is the only way that the implementation can be effective. So, as I told in the introduction, most of our waste goes to landfills. We don't do much composting. We don't do much recycling yet. So that's why it's so complex. It's not only capturing methane from the landfill, which is also important, and for that we need finance, for example, and technology transfer. But yeah, so in order to move to have effective implementation, it is very important to look the co-benefits for the communities and not only work on the methane reductions. And also in the agriculture sector is a big issue, the food security and have good food. So you don't have to look only in the methane emissions, and that's very important for the communities. Thank you.
May I jump on that?
Yeah, Gustavo, if you could answer the same, benefits to communities that you see with the policies.
Just very brief, I just wanted to jump on this because I think it's a very important matter, no? Sometimes we do everything and we don't take into account the community, no? We don't take into account the locals, no? We don't take into account their needs, their problems, etc. So, for example, in our case in Mexico, we do work very close with the people in the field, with the people in the communities. Many times it's NGOs, it's interested citizens, or it's indigenous communities, no? And in our case, for example, we do give them advice, no? Because they don't know the law, no? They don't know the policy, they don't know the authority, they don't know what to do, they don't know which way to go. So we do a lot of advice, and sometimes even though we are the ones who have to prepare the legal actions, no? In order for them to go to court, no? And bring the cases against the who are polluting or those who are giving any permits that are out of the law. But also we help them to access to information, no? In the case of Mexico, we have, like in the US, the Freedom of Information Act, no? We have something like that in Mexico. But people don't know how to use it. Even sometimes they don't know it exists, no? So we help them, no? In order to access to this information, in order for them to have the information that they require in order to act, to do something in the way they wanna do it. And finally, we also help them to talk to the media. I think it's very important to bring the cases to the public spot. So it's very important because the authorities feel the pressure, no? When you go to the media. It's not only the legal action. We believe have to do both at the same time. But sometimes it's more pressure to the government, the media, than the legal action itself. Because the public official, it's in the media, and it's seen as somebody that is not doing his job. So they say, oh, what am I going to do? No? So I think these are some ideas, no, on how to move with the community.
Thank you, Gustavo. So maybe I'm gonna pick on you again, Claire, here for some of your thoughts on the agriculture sector and how to reduce methane from there, because I think for a lot of us who work on methane, the oil and gas, it's sort of maybe where we started, and it's well understood. Waste management and landfills is pretty easy to get your head wrapped around, but I personally struggle with how to approach the agriculture sector. So what are your thoughts on how we can tackle the emissions there?
Yeah, happy to speak to that. And just to lay out the bigger picture here, when we think about what the largest sources of anthropogenic methane are, about 35% of that is from the fossil energy sector, about 40% of it is from the agricultural sector, and about 20% of it is from the waste and wastewater sector, and the remaining 10 or so percent are from other sources. So agriculture is actually the largest source of overall methane emissions, but it comes from fairly diverse sources within that sector as well. The largest portion of agricultural emissions are from enteric fermentation, cow burps, fairly straightforward for us to understand. But there are also major sources from manure because of the anaerobic digestion that produces methane from manure management, and also from rice. And so each of these sectors or subsectors has very different mitigation opportunities, which also differ significantly based on the profile of the country that you're discussing. So speaking first about enteric fermentation, which is probably the one that people think about the first when they think about agricultural methane emissions, there can be 100-fold difference in the methane intensity of a cow in, say, Kenya versus a cow in the United States. And this is because of the productivity of these animals. So actually, one of the most effective ways to cut methane in the agricultural sector across the world is simply to improve feed quality, improve animal health, and therefore improve the productivity per head of cattle for the amount of methane that comes out of that's associated with each gallon of milk or each pound of beef, for example. And so by just generally improving livestock productivity, you not only get lower methane intensity production of beef and dairy, but you also get significant nutritional and economic development co-benefits as well, because it means there is more milk available to consume in these communities, which by and large are sort of smallholder agricultural communities as well. When you're talking about, say, the United States or Australia or New Zealand or other more developed countries with agricultural output, there are a lot of very interesting activities happening in the innovation space for feed additives like 3-NOP or algae that can be used without any impact on the actual productivity or health of the animal, but which can significantly reduce the amount of methane that is being emitted by these cows as part of their rumination process. And we're investing a lot in R&D in this sector. Our partners across the world are as well. So I think we can very reasonably see more widespread deployment of these methane reduction feed additives around the world, in addition to the types of activities that we need to see for animal health and general development in less productive countries. In terms of manure management, it's a fairly straightforward process in which you capture the manure, install a biodigester, and you can use that high concentration methane for things like on-site power generation or heat, or you can just flare it with more efficient flares. And in the rice sector, there can also be very straightforward interventions that mostly involve reducing the amount of time a rice paddy is being flooded, since that is the time in which anaerobic digestion happens and you see methane emissions from the rice sector. Those ones are largely engineering challenges now. So how do you essentially have a rice paddy that is level enough or has the ability to control water flows enough to be able to do things like alternate wetting and drying or other approaches? But in terms of technology, that is totally feasible now. And as with all the things that we've been discussing so far, the key barriers are more around local capacity building, access to finance, access to other types of resources to do this work.
Okay, I got it. Thank you. Thank you for that. A question for you, Jeremy. So, I think in British Columbia and Canada has, learned that there's more to learn about how to tackle methane emissions as we've been working on it. And there's been great benefits of sharing that information within Canada between the regulators and the industry and so on. Do you have any thoughts on where that needs to go next, and also how that could be enhanced in terms of sharing that information with international partners?
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned barriers in one of your earlier questions. I mean, clearly one of the key barriers is and this is a totally overused cliche, but it's very hard to manage what you can't measure. So we've made a lot of strides across the world in being able to accurately monitor and measure methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, but there is more to do. And then, so on that, we in BC are actually working with the United Nations Environmental Program and I might butcher this, International Methane Emissions Organization. Is that a thing? IMEO? Observatory, almost got it. And actually Carleton University out of Ottawa to really up our game on aerial monitoring, as well as ground monitoring in tanks and compressors, because one thing we've learned is there's a lot more slippage there than we thought originally. And really the end goal of that work, and it's about a 3-year study, is to and I heard my colleague talk about bottom-up inventories, right? Like that I think is the goal here, is so we have a more accurate sense of actual emissions and a more accurate inventory rather than top-down modeled inventories. So we're excited about doing that, and then the results of that work are actually going to inform the EU regs that are coming around the emissions intensity of imported fossil fuel. So, the question was about collaboration sharing. I think that's one area where we're seeing some good progress.
Thanks, Jeremy. So, Carolina, maybe this will be sort of our last question, but I'll give everybody a chance to jump in on it if they like. But the information sharing. So, because we're at an international event, how could that be enhanced in order to, in your view, in order to accelerate action on methane?
Yes. about information sharing, and I think we have to learn about the energy sector, because you have really good data. And for example, we were talking about agriculture. I want to turn off to waste. We need better information on waste. And we have good news, we are working together and we are going to announce a waste map, a waste methane assessment platform in order to have open data, to go there to promote transparency and to promote also collaboration between communities, because on waste, you were talking about this, we need to work with communities because there we have a huge environmental justice issue. So if we share with communities our knowledge and we build capacity with them, then we have a good opportunity. So I think that it's important to complement what we have been discussing here. I'm not going to repeat everything. So that is additional. I think it's so important, because we know that in the energy sector, you have really good information on data, and we don't have that for the waste sector, neither that good information for agriculture. But yes, of course, we need more NRD and on that. And also we need on agriculture, I think what is important, and it's related with information, is that we don't need to wait until we have the perfect solution. I think that is something that is going on in the agriculture sector, what I think it's really important, because it's like they could be part of the solution, but they don't need to wait until they have everything solved to make the action.
Gustavo, you started off your comments with some very strong points about accountability and transparency, which speak to information and information sharing. Did you have anything more to add in global context?
Is this a closing? Yeah. Okay, I would like to give my final remarks by saying three things. The first is that we need to make sure that the information is accessible to the public. No, we don't need the authority to hide the information as they sometimes do. No, it has to be fully disclosed, fully open, and everyone who wants to see the data may have access to the information. Second, related to this, transparency. No, and transparency and transparency. I believe that our governments are moving every time more and more to openness, no? And I think that has to be the case. And finally, I would like to say that something that I also mentioned before, that has to be about the accurate information. No? I mean, we may have access to the information, but it's not accurate. No? So we need to have the real information of the things that are happening out there in order for us as citizens, as an NGOs or interested persons, to take actions in the way we believe we have to go. So I would like to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Camila, do you have any final comments? Or you could speak to that last point around sharing of information globally. Yeah, I'll get you to grab that one.
I just wanted to make a comment about agriculture because technology is there, so it's a way to moving forward. But in many countries like ours, agriculture is very traditional. So people don't trust just in science, and if they say this is better, they won't trust us. They have a tradition and they follow their tradition. So that's it. That's why agriculture sector is so hard to create capacities and to change how it is done. It's usually, like in the last 30 years, they have been doing the same. They're hard to move. And so that's, I don't know how I don't have the answer on how to to tackle that or what's the best practice. And talking about sharing information, yeah, I think that sharing best practices, we have done that in different areas, in transparency, but also in what mitigation actions work better, and with a sectorial focus, for example. I think sharing best practices is a way of accelerating action. That's
Claire, any final thoughts?
Well, one thing that I forgot to mention in my sort of opening spiel about what the United States is doing. So I mentioned that we're very eager to support other countries in terms of reducing their methane emissions. So I just want to give a quick shout out to some of the partners who are helping to work with us in that space. I mentioned before the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is a collection of states and NGOs and IGOs dedicated to reducing emissions from short-lived climate pollutants, including methane and others, that can be some of our fastest climate solutions while also improving air quality. The International Methane Emissions Observatory within the UN Environment Program is also a key partner around these data and transparency-related questions. The Global Methane Hub also is very useful in finding the resourcing to actually work on these challenges. And there's a number of just United States resources that I want to make note of in case anybody in the audience wants to make some of these connections. So our U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, has a lot of activities they're taking to reduce methane emissions through development context. Our U.S. Trade and Development Agency can support in the actual project preparation work to find investable methane projects. And then our Exim Bank and Development Finance Corporation are eagerly looking for projects that can reduce methane that they can invest in. So as we're speaking to some of the financing challenges we were talking about earlier, the U.S. is here and eager to try to fill that gap in methane finance. And we're always interested in hearing any opportunities that come across your radar, and of course in sharing these resources with the world as well. So.
Thank you. Well, at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Jonathan to close us out, but thank you to everybody as the moderator. Great conversation, and hopefully you can stand up here with me and have a photograph taken so we can all remember this for the rest of our lives as well.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of you. I think one of the things that is really, there's a lot that came out on this panel of the action that's been happening and going to be happening in the Americas, but to be honest, it's just the tip of the iceberg. We didn't have Colombia up here. We've been working with Colombia for years. As Gustavo mentioned, they just issued their methane regulations for the oil and gas sector earlier this year. Ecuador is rapidly working on methane policy for the oil and gas sector. They just issued recently flaring regulations that will also help control methane emissions. In Argentina, there's a bill in the Argentine Senate to cut methane emissions as well. There is a ton of stuff. Peru's got a lot of work going on the waste sector. They're trying to mimic a little bit of what Chile did as well. There's a ton of work going on in the Americas. So hopefully next time we get together, we'll have an even larger panel. We'll need a bigger stage, I think, to be able to talk about all this work. I just put a plug in for tomorrow, not at this pavilion, but at the Egypt pavilion. We're going to do an event that focuses on Africa and the work that's been happening in Africa to reduce methane emissions from a variety of sectors as well. That's at, hold on, I got to look because I'm bad with calendars. That is at 3:30 at the Egypt pavilion. So join us over there for a discussion of what Africa's been working on to reduce methane emissions from a variety of sectors. So with that, I will close, but first say thank you to all of you. I appreciate your time and all of the efforts that you all have been putting in to move all of your countries forward on this issue. So thank you.